So I read an article a couple of weeks ago, and it said that overnight success is a myth. But I've got some good news for you, because it's not a myth. It's real, it's here. But only if you look at it through the lens of Steve Jobs, who very astutely says that overnight success stories take a long time. In my experience, people have a desire to be successful. However, often people don't really know what success looks like or how to achieve it. And I believe in our roles as leaders in SaaS companies, it's our role to help people understand who they are, what they want to achieve, and how to go about achieving that. One of the most common obstacles I see through these discussions is this kind of underlying desire for overnight success and having it all. However, these wishes have a habit of making us impatient, shortcut-minded, and capricious in our approach, and it can have a devastating effect on performance and judgment. What most people call overnight success is in fact the market suddenly realizing the value of a great product or service that's been kept in obscurity for too long while its creators refuse to give up. NewVoiceMedia is a good example of this. So the business was founded in the late 90s and was very much a technology-orientated, engineering-orientated business for the first 10 years. And so it's true to say our creators refused to give up. I joined the business in 2013 at around the time when we secured Series B funding. Series A was led by Notion. I know Chris Topman and the team are here today, so thank you, Chris and the team, for your support over the years. And as I say, I joined in around 2013 at Series B. And the business is going for a really interesting time because we're reaching a point of maturity in our growth, and we're starting to make this journey from startup to scale-up. So over the next 5.5 years, prior to the acquisition by Vonage in October 2018, we had some significant growth and went on a fantastic journey. Lots of milestones that we're very proud of, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about those today. But there's one that was particularly memorable that will stick with me for many years, and that's that initial challenge you have to try and get onto the Gartner Magic Quadrant, and you kind of make your first appearance kind of middle of the field, and you work tirelessly to improve your position. And over the course of 3 years, we managed to navigate ourselves to a very clear top right position, which is a great thing to be a part of. There are a number of reasons why the opportunity at NewVoiceMedia really appealed to me. Huge addressable market that's still vastly on-premise, and we were approaching that market with a highly differentiated message from the competition. The business was just starting to form what turned out to be a market-leading and a sector-leading go-to-market sales motion within the Salesforce ecosystem, which was really interesting to be a part of. And that latterly resulted in us getting some significant investment from Salesforce Ventures. But the bit that was really exciting for me was joining a UK technology business where I had close proximity to the C-suite and a seat at the table where the strategy was set. Now, I could talk about all the great things we achieved over those 5.5 years that I was with the business prior to our exit. But what I really wanted to do was spend my time here talking about the things that I'll carry with me should I have the opportunity to repeat this success elsewhere. And the phase I want to talk about is startup to scale up. And for me, this is needs to be a very conscious phase of a SaaS company. And the chances are, when you're 0 to 10 million, you're very much in hand-to-hand combat as a business. And 10 million could be pounds, euro, dollars, it doesn't really matter. It's just this kind of psychological threshold that you're trying to get through. You're in hand-to-hand combat, you're establishing product market fit, you're likely under 150 people. Customer drives the roadmap and also provides cash to fuel the growth of the business. You're a lean team in a single location with very tight reporting lines. It's a very demanding environment, but it's very cohesive by nature. However, when you go past the 10 million point, it's a game changer. You've likely raised some investment. The reason you were attractive was due to the skilled, talented, motivated people that you've attracted, and this is an environment that you want to foster and develop as you grow. You're probably moving from a single product, single market, single geography, to a multi-market, multi-product, multi-geography type offering, and this places a lot of strain on the institution. So the organization becomes far more complex to manage, and often people don't understand or appreciate the complexity and the cost of this complexity. And this complexity also has a habit of slowing things down. So unless you're very structured as a business, many vendors struggle to find their way through this transition from startup to scale-up. Often with a wall of capital, organizations can afford to be inefficient while scaling, but really they're just papering over the cracks. And when this happens, what you see businesses having is an acceptable outcome rather than a heroic outcome. Capital, of course, comes at a cost, and scaling the business is complex and multidimensional versus the market data, which is very simple and very linear. And that, unfortunately, is the fallacy of the SaaS market that we operate within. So, for example, once you understand and control your customer acquisition cost, which we refer to as CAC, it's a very simple metric that then says if you invest X in sales, then you'll generate Y in bookings that will ultimately flow into revenue. The data set shows a nice linear curve. But what this doesn't take into account is the drag that's placed upon the institution when you scale internationally, for example. When we secured the Series B round, it was around $50 million. We expanded into San Francisco, New York, Sydney, and continental Europe. We invested heavily in product. However, in relative terms, we probably overinvested in our go-to-market strategy in relation to product. And what we found is it took away resources from our core high-growth regions. And unfortunately, that CAC metric and these industry benchmarks that we look at don't necessarily take into account the drag that's placed on the organization when undertaking some of these types of activities. So without real thought, simply scaling the business from 300 to 400 people over a short period of time can really grind the business to a halt and slow everyone down. And there are many points of reference for this. I'm sure people like you and I would look at companies like Amazon and look at them as a very slick machine that's been operating for a number of years. However, there were times in their growth that it was utter chaos internally. For those of you that have read Jeff Bezos' book, The Everything Store, he talks about one Christmas a number of years ago where the executive team were asked to cancel their Christmas vacation in the run-up to Christmas. And they were all on the warehouse floors packing parcels and gift-wrapping presents so that they could fulfill their Christmas orders. So I started thinking about this to say, well, how would an organization get through that phase if they're operating in a very chaotic environment? And the conclusion I came up with was that an engine of profitability affords inefficiency and chaos. And unfortunately, as SaaS companies go from startup to scale-up, there's often not that engine of profitability that can afford that inefficiency. So as leaders in our industry, I believe that it's our role to mitigate the risk of inefficiency and chaos as we move from startup to scale-up to ensure that the shareholders and investors get a heroic outcome. And as sales leaders specifically, for me, this comes down to understanding the mechanics of running that sales machine. So what do I mean by mechanics? Well, let's explore this together in a little bit more detail. So for me, running a SaaS sales organization revolves around 5 core pillars. And each of those 5 pillars has 5 sub-pillars. So I've got the first 3 of the core pillars on the screen, which is kind of getting the right people on the bus, which seems pretty obvious. Figuring out how you generate demand. The third pillar is all around funnel execution. So funnel execution is something that's I'm really passionate about. It's really important to me. The way we look at it in the business is we look at the funnel in 3 distinct segments. So if you think about top of the funnel being territory planning, prospecting, getting executive engagement, running that first meeting, running some discovery. Mid-funnel is about getting high and wide within the organization, starting to uncover metrics around the as-is and to-be state that you can start building out the business case, building a champion, getting access to the economic buyer. It goes on and on. So think around about 10 categories in each of those. We then look at the skills and the knowledge. So what's the knowledge I need to be effective in my role, and what is the skills that I need to use that knowledge effectively to be successful? We then build that into a competency matrix, score the business, and that then informs the sales enablement we need to do to increase breadth of performance across the sales organization. I'm particularly excited by the rise of sales enablement technologies, and I know that Richard Langham from HighSpot's on stage a little bit later. Rich and I worked together for about 5 years right now. So super excited about some of these technologies that are coming through to support this component of the machine. Pete Crosby is going to talk a little bit about the sales machine in a bit more detail later. So the bit I wanted to spend the rest of my time on is the first pillar, which is people. So for me, it's important to hire well. Once you've got those people on board, you need to ramp them. Once you've got a ramped sales organization, you need to focus on creating a good breadth of performance and moving your the midfield up. We all know coaching and develop is really important. And then succession planning. And succession planning gets overlooked, in my opinion. And when I'm hiring, I'm always thinking about succession planning because I want to hire people that have the potential to be better than me and are going to be knocking on my door for my job probably quicker than I'd feel comfortable in reality. And it reminds me of a story when I was at Right Now Technologies. I don't know how many of you know the business. It was a great success story out of Bozeman in Montana. Got acquired by Oracle Corporation for around $1.5 billion in 2012. And as I say, Richard and I, and in fact Tom Castley, spent a number of years there. And they have a kind of a leadership program, and a handful of people get selected each year to go on this kind of fast-track development program. And I was lucky enough to be put on this program. And every year our CEO would pick one person that he'd mentor on that program, and he'd normally pick a sales leader, and he'd normally try and see whether they pass the sniff test. Generally, you'll either disappear off the face of the earth halfway through the year, or you'll tend to kind of go on to achieve good things. And I don't know whether it's fortunate or lucky, I managed to get through that year unscathed. And I remember my first call with Greg, and he said, "Jeremy, is there someone in your team that could take your job tomorrow?" So it's kind of my first call with Greg, and I kind of thought for a moment and was like, "Well, no, there isn't actually at the moment, Greg." And he said, "Well, you're currently unpromotable, so I will not be considering you for any future roles within the business until there's someone that can seamlessly take your role tomorrow." And I've really carried that with me, so it's something that I think about through the hiring process and through all these stages in the people process. So, how are we doing for time? A little bit shorter than I thought we were going to be. So I'm going to whiz through this next section. The bit I want to talk about is hiring. So hiring is really critical for me. And I have a lens that I use, that I've been using for the last 10 years or so, that's in constant refinement. And it's TEC. And TEC stands for Talent, Experience, and Culture. And I always spell it with a small e in the middle, because for me, experience is overrated. So if you think about hiring through that lens, if I can find someone that's highly talented, that's a great cultural fit for my business, I can give them the experience they need. You run that in any other way, it doesn't work for me. You give me someone that's been selling what we sell for 10 years, who's a great cultural fit, that has no raw talent, then they're probably not going to be successful. Likewise, if they're hugely talented with 10 years experience, but they're not a great cultural fit for our business, probably not going to work out. So TEC is the common language we use across the business, that we're all talking the same language as we put people through the hiring process. A couple of things I'll touch on underneath. Is that clock right? Okay, I'm just going to keep going then. So, okay, cool. So underneath TEC, there are a couple of other lenses I use. The first one, I'm going to touch on three of these. The first one is what I call 3 legs on the stool. So the first thing I'll do in an interview process is make sure that someone's in balance. And balance for me, the 3 legs of the stool are your work or your career, your personal and family life, and your other sporting or hobbies or interests. And for me, it's important to have that balance. So I want to hear someone talk about something in the early stage of the interview that they're really passionate about outside of work. What do they do to find that release? How do they find time to decompress outside of their family and their work? And of course, any 3-legged stool has to sit on very firm ground, and the firm ground is their health. So unless we're healthy and we've got a balanced stool, that's a good perspective to try and get a read on from someone. The next lens I use is like a Venn diagram: hungry, humble, people smart. So people smart being emotional intelligence. It's an extract from the book, The Ideal Team Player, that I've adapted. So think about that sequence like we did with TEC. If I find someone that's humble and hungry, but with no emotional intelligence, it's not going to work for me. If I find someone that's hungry with good emotional intelligence, but a little bit arrogant, I think they know everything, it's not going to work for me. You can play that out in any way. And there are good questions. I've got a set of sequencing questions under each of these that I can kind of flush out, and the hiring managers in the business can use to make sure that we're covering all the bases in this process. The final one is something that Greg, my mentor at Right Now, taught me. He said there are 3 things you can't teach anyone, and that's initiative, intelligence, and integrity. And if someone hasn't got those 3 things, there's nothing you can do about it. You can teach the rest. And people sometimes say to me, well, how do you interview? How do you test for integrity, for example? And I say, well, I ask someone, I say, well, if I was to ask your colleagues and your peers whether you're a person of integrity, what would they say? And everyone says, well, yeah, absolutely, they'd say I'm a person of integrity. And I'd say, well, how would they have come to that conclusion? And you'd be surprised at the amount of people that don't have the level of self-awareness to be able to articulate very clearly on how people around them would come to a conclusion that they're a person of deep integrity. So in closing, as I've been hiring first-line managers into the business and sales leaders into my organization for the first time over the last year, I've kind of reflected on how TEC applies to hiring leadership, because of course experience is important in leadership. And what I've done is I've changed the experience to emotional intelligence. So for me, it becomes talent, emotional intelligence, and culture as a core lens. So, in closing, I guess there are three takeaways from me. You know, overnight success takes a long time. If you're earlier in your career, then exhibit patience, persistence, and find that right balance between energy and focus. Again, I could do another whole session on energy and focus, because if you've got huge amounts of energy but no focus, you're not going to achieve anything. Whereas if you've got massive focus but no energy, you're not going to achieve anything. So the balance needs to be right between those two. It always feels harder on the inside from what it looks like on the outside. This is what it felt like for me for the last 6 years. We were slogging away. We were grinding away at it week in, week out, month in, month out. But people were coming up to us on the outside saying, you guys are having a great ride. You know, you're kind of on this journey. So it's going to feel harder on the inside. And then finally, I'd encourage you all to become very conscious and very self-aware about the transition from startup to scale-up, and specifically around the sales machine that you're building. Because as you go out to interview for bigger roles in the future, you need to be articulate about what you're going to bring to the business, and very conscious about the mechanics of what you're going to build in order to, as we talked about, remove any chaos and provide a heroic outcome for your investors. Thanks very much.